So it was only fitting that on the day of the release of Diablo 2 Resurrected, Blizzard would also stay in theme for World of Warcraft and come out with some announcements that are also very old school, because the changes that they are going through are going to touch things like new Timewalking Dungeons being available, as well as changes to old raid bosses to be made easier to solo. So legacy content for Transmog Hunters, Pet Hunters, Mount Hunters, and whatnot. Some of these changes have been awaited by the community for a long time. There have been quite a few bosses in specifically quite a few nasty old raids which have been kept almost undoable if you were solo. They were one of the more lively legacy content raids open in the Looking For group, where people don't even bother trying to solo them. They just go to those raids with a few people because doing them solo was quite hard. In 9.1.5, Blizzard is planning some changes starting from Nighthold. Now, as a legacy raid, as an old raid that you can solo, Nighthold was actually kind of fine when it came to mechanics all the way up until you got to Mythic Gul'dan. The main issue of Mythic Gul'dan was the parasitic Shadow Demon, because in and of itself, getting one of these guys to chase you, to reach you, to stun you, and to apply you with the parasitic wound debuff wasn't that big of a deal. You would get stunned a few times, but eventually you would take the boss down. The main issue is that then Gul'dan is going to cast this one again. So now you have two of these guys chasing you, stunning you twice at different intervals, and after that they're gonna spawn more of these parasitic demon adds, and then it's going to continue more and more. There is going to be more of them until eventually you basically are perma-stunned and you just end up dying after quite a while. So the first change planned for 9.1.5 is that the parasitic shadow demon's shadowy gaze is no longer going to stun players. So that's it. Now it's going to be much easier to complete your solo run of Nighthold in Mythic difficulty, where this mechanic is going to present itself. Now you can do it in Mythic. But in Legion, there was a much more problematic raid that you couldn't quite solo. It wasn't Nighthold itself, it was rather Antorus. Antorus had a series of bosses that were very, very difficult to solo, and people just gave up even trying to do it. Maybe they took it up as a challenge, but most of them were just going in as a group when they wanted to do this type of transmog runs for Antorus. Now Blizzard is trying to make it more manageable to solo by getting rid of certain mechanics which required coordination and team play with other players, starting from Agramar. The main problem with Agramar is the fact that he has Empowered Flame Rend. Empowered Flame Rend gives you a knockback based on how many players are soaking the Flame Rend. And if you're trying to solo it, well, you're gonna get knocked back to Africa and die. Get knocked off the platform and die. So in 9.1.5, this knockback being shared by the amount of players hit is going to be removed. So now the knockback is going to be just 15 yards. So as long as you are roughly close to the center of the platform, you're going to be able to survive. It is still going to be a DPS race because Agramar still has his infinitely stacking fire damage, which eventually is going to kill you, so you will still have to do some pretty good damage on the boss, but at the very least now you have a chance, as opposed to just getting knocked off the platform immediately unless you are a class or a spec that can deal with knockbacks. Blizzard is also planning on changing a few other bosses like Imonar. Imonar had the spell Sleep Canister, which would just put you to sleep. The main issue is that this ability was not being cast on a pet. Whenever you had a pet out, if the pet was tanking, you, the player, were not counted as the tank, so Sleep Canister would go on you. And the TLDR is that you would basically get perma put to sleep. So unless your pet can solo the entire fight, you would end up dying eventually. This part is also no longer going to work. The sleep canister ability, the sleep, is no longer going to be cast, even if you are a player trying to solo this with a pet being out. The other change, which is another one of these annoying mechanics when you wanted to solo something, was the proximity damage reduction, like Coven of Shivara. The two mobs would get a 99% damage reduction shield if they were close together, which isn't an issue when you have two tanks and you are spreading the two bosses, and it becomes an issue when you're trying to solo them because you can't spread them. So Now, the Shivan Pact, the damage reduction buff that they would gain, is going to be removed. So it went from being a near impossible fight to do solo to be one of the easiest ones. Just pull them together and kill them. No longer they are going to have this type of problem. Now, even though these bosses in Antorus have been made much more easily doable solo, you still have a couple of problems. One, which isn't that major, is on Argus himself. You know, Argus is a quite searched after boss. It has not only some pretty good transmog, but also the Shackled Urzul mount. The issue with Argus is, similarly to Agromar, he has the infinitely stacking soul-rending sight, which eventually is going to kill you. So it is a DPS race, which means you can't go there in green questing gear to solo Mythic Argus. At the very least now, the stacking, the infinite stacking of this debuff has been nerfed. It's going to apply more slowly. The real difficult part, as you might know, however, of Antorus is the essence of Eonar fight, the platform jumping fight. That is not changed. That is still the same. So the vast majority of the specs, without too much movement and too many additional ways of getting to close the gaps between one platform and the other in the essence of Eonar fight, are still not going to be able to solo this one, unfortunately. I guess Blizzard is trying to come out with a way on how to deal with this encounter, because this encounter is a very unique one, is a very weird one. It's not like many of the others encounters you normally see, so it's probably a little bit harder to also figure out how to deal with this. But at the very least, it's good to see that they are planning on changing these bosses. Yes, you could be cynical and just complain that all of these changes should have happened earlier. After all, by the time the new expansion comes out, all of this becomes old content. Blizzard doesn't really have any duty to keep these bosses balanced for people who want to clear them. There is really no more need to keeping all of these mechanics intact. If anything, your only duty would be to make them more easy, so that people can go back and clear these bosses. It's not going to matter if you're going to remove perhaps entire mechanics from the fight, if it makes it easier to solo or to do with a couple of people, because they are getting in there just because they want the transmog or the mounts or whatever. So I think the changes are coming quite late. At the very least, they are coming. We also have more changes talking about old school stuff, because Blizzard is planning on adding more Timewalking Dungeons to the pool. Now, it is not quite clear if these dungeons are going to come in to replace currently existing dungeons in the Timewalking pool, or if they're going to come in to improve and widen the pool of available dungeons. Especially when you consider that Blizzard was following a pretty clear pattern when it came to Timewalking Dungeons, because the Timewalking Dungeons for Wrath of the Lich King were 6, and for Cataclysm they were 6, and for Mists they were 6, and for Warlords they were 6. So I sent these numbers down to the lab, and they came back just yesterday, and they told me that it looks like Blizzard likes to have 6 dungeons per Timewalking event. So the new dungeons being primed to be added in the Timewalking pool are Underbog, the Botanica, and the Blood Furnace for Burning Crusade, Atgard Keep, Azul Nerub, and the Forge of Souls for Wrath, Blackrock Caverns for Cataclysm, Grimrail Depot for Warlords of Draenor, and Scholomance for Mists. So you would have to break this 6 dungeon pattern if this were to just be added to the pool. The only new pattern that would make sense that I can see is that TBC and Wrath have way more dungeons than Cataclysm, Warlords, and Mists. So adding 3 more for TBC and Wrath and just 1 for the later expansions is simply because TBC and Wrath have more to pick from compared to the other 3. That's the only one that makes sense. Now, however, whenever we talk about Timewalking, there is going to be the usual complaint, which is the fact that at the moment, for example, if you go to the vendor, the Timewalking vendor, you can get 164 item level loot. You can do the dungeon, you can clear the dungeon themselves for 184 item level loot. So the main complaint is that the gear is completely useless, of course. You know, Timewalking itself can reward you with some more than a dozen mounts. It can give you a wide list of pets and toys that you can get from all the different types of vendors from Wrath to all the way up to Warlords. But when it comes to the gear itself, it's a very outdated type of activity. It's basically not even up to par to be able to gear up an alt anymore. Before it was kind of okay. Nowadays, it's not even that. Nowadays, time walking is basically for leveling characters, not even more for alts. Now you can get much higher gear for alts by doing other activities, especially Korthia, for example, with the caches, the armaments you can pick up, also bind on account, so you can do it on your main and then pass them on your alt you want to gear up. And people usually complain about this, why are you putting this much time in time walking? For example, these we just went over are 9 different dungeons that Blizzard is planning to add to the pool of the time walking activity, yet is not even that big of a desirable activity for alts and undergear characters because it's not really going to give them with anything valuable. Now, we have heard explanations for time walking and why it's not that high on item level when it came from Blizzard. The main idea is that being able to drop down the item level of time walking to effectively irrelevance, okay, to something that nobody's going to care about, is going to allow them a much easier room when it comes to balancing, because remember that the loot you get from time walking is based and balanced on old expansions. For example, you can still get good old times, you can still get things like rings with primary stat, rings with agility, for example, or rings with intellect, for example, which don't exist anymore and have not existed ever since Legion, I think. So if you were to get, for example, someone might say, we could get time walking gear all the way up to, 226 item level, maybe 213 item level. There is a very high chance, for example, that a ring, so a finger slot item at 226 item level with a primary stat would actually be better than anything you can get now, simply because anything you can get now is not going to have the primary stat on a ring, making those time walking rings much stronger. Not to mention things like trinkets, the necessity of balancing perhaps some possibly super overpowered trinkets that Blizzard doesn't have to worry about now because the item level of time walking is so low that it can't possibly pose a threat. It's also one of the reasons why when we have the weekly event, which wants you to do some time walking dungeons for a much higher item level reward in the cache, in the weekly reward, the reward comes from the raid. The reward is not going to be a piece of time walking gear at that much higher item level. It's instead going to be a piece of gear from usually normal raid quality gear. So their logic has been for a while to not have to worry about it, to not have to worry about time walking, balancing the gear with the current content. So they can just leave it on a side. They can still make it good for some people because they might want to get the badges, the time walking badges for their mounts or their pets or their toys, as well as the leveling characters. They might want to get some quick and easy experience plus quick and easy leveling gear, but not as a legitimate way to gear up an alt character at max level with current content gear. That doesn't seem to be one of the things that Blizzard has been shaping time walking to be right now. So that's why you will feel like the gear is shit and that you don't really want or you don't really need to do time walking as an alt anymore to get good gear, to get good catch-up gear, because it's not been a thing for a while now. Now, closing these old school changes in memory of the release of Diablo 2 Resurrected, we can go for a newer change, however, which is a tiny change to the Path of Ascension. We have already gotten a bunch of QOL changes planned for 9.1.5 for the Ember Court. So now we are getting one for the Kyrian activity. There is no longer going to be a cost at all to enter the Path of Ascension. Now the medallions of service are only going to be used for the crafting. There is also going to be a baseline 20% buff to all of the soul binds in the Path of Ascension that can also be increased progressively in the Brazier of Progressive Power in the arena itself. Also, the drop rates of all of the Path of the Ascension crafting components have been increased by 10%, and the soul mirror shards can also now drop from the Mosworn Kyrian in the Mo. So those are the QOL changes for the Path of Ascension. I am eagerly awaiting the QOL changes for the flesh crafting mechanic of the Necrolord. I don't even know what they would change because it's not a very good side activity like the Path of Ascension or the Ember Cord, so I wonder what they would even change. And then we finished the video with an actual, very recent bit of news with a round of applause to the world first plus 28 completed in time. The first time ever a plus 28 has been completed is on Tyrannical. People have been slowly getting to the point to see that Tyrannical is now much more doable, and perhaps, but this they are saying it very quietly, perhaps even easier than Fortified. It's cool to point out because the dungeon has been cleared by a Windwalker Monk, a Sub-Rogue and a Frost Mage, so up to this point, business as usual. The real change is that it has been cleared by a combo of Protection Paladin and Restoration Shaman, which is basically the only Prot Paladin Resto Shaman combo in high keys right now. There is no other group running with this combo, so it is pretty surprising to see this dungeon being cleared by this comp. So very cool bit of news. It's nice to see this type of variety. Maybe not as much in the DPS department, sure, but the tank and healer one was definitely a very cool thing to see. Now, with this, we can close the video for this autumnal Thursday. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you've enjoyed the content and want to support the channel, you can leave a like, comment down below, as well as subscribing to this channel, to the newsletter for the channel, to the OnlyFans part of the channel, as well as to the monthly mystery box shipping for this channel. Thank you guys anyways, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, really bad day today. I don't know why, I've got a bad feeling.